Picture a slice of Swiss cheese. If you grew up watching cartoons, you probably imagine a bright yellow block filled with perfectly round holes, and maybe a clever little mouse hiding inside one of them. It's such a famous image that the holes almost feel like the whole point of Swiss cheese. But here's the strange part. Those holes are not carved out by machines, and they certainly aren't made by hungry mice. For a long time, people believed they understood exactly why those holes appear. But then something unexpected happened. The holes began to disappear. Cheese that was famous for its holes suddenly started coming out almost completely solid, and scientists had to figure out why. Welcome to Simple Things Surprising Histories. Today, we're exploring the curious science behind one of the most recognizable foods in the world. Why is cheese full of holes? To understand the holes, we first need to understand how Swiss cheese is made. Cheese begins with milk, but it doesn't stay milk for very long. Cheesemakers add special bacterial cultures that start a slow process of fermentation. In Swiss-style cheeses like Emmental, one particular type of bacteria plays an important role. Its name is Propionibacterium freudenreichii. As the cheese ages, these bacteria feed on lactic acid that forms inside the cheese. And as they digest this acid, they produce a gas, carbon dioxide. Normally, gas would simply escape into the air, but inside a wheel of cheese, the texture is already thick and semi-solid. That means the gas becomes trapped. When enough gas collects in one place, it pushes the cheese outward and forms a small bubble. Over time, these bubbles grow larger, creating the round holes that cheesemakers call eyes. So in simple terms, the famous holes in Swiss cheese are tiny pockets of carbon dioxide created during fermentation. But for many years, scientists thought this explanation was the entire story. Then something strange happened that suggested the process was more complicated. In the early 2000s, cheesemakers in Switzerland began noticing something unusual. Their Swiss cheese was changing. The holes were getting smaller. Sometimes they barely formed at all. This was a serious problem because those holes are one of the defining features of traditional Swiss cheese. The confusing part was that nothing seemed different. Cheesemakers were using the same milk, the same bacteria, in the same aging process that had worked for generations, yet the cheese was coming out almost solid. For years, the reason remained a mystery. Then, in 2015, researchers at an agricultural research institute in Switzerland finally uncovered the surprising explanation. The problem wasn't the bacteria. The problem was cleanliness. To understand what was happening, scientists looked closely at how bubbles actually form. Gas doesn't always turn into a bubble on its own. It often needs a tiny starting point, something for the gas molecules to gather around. Scientists call this process nucleation. In traditional dairy farms long ago, cows were milked in open barns. Tiny particles of hay dust naturally floated through the air and sometimes fell into the milk. These microscopic specks were harmless, but they turned out to be extremely important. When the bacteria later produced carbon dioxide inside the cheese, the gas collected around those tiny particles. That allowed bubbles to grow and form the famous holes. Modern milking systems, however, are much cleaner and more sealed than older methods. The milk contained far fewer dust particles. Without those tiny anchor points, the gas often dissolved into the cheese instead of forming large bubbles. No particles meant fewer bubbles, and fewer bubbles meant fewer holes. So the holes in Swiss cheese are not just the work of bacteria. They are the result of three things working together: fermentation, trapped gas, and tiny particles that allow bubbles to form. In other words, those iconic holes are partly thanks to microscopic bits of hay from old dairy barns. It's a small detail, but it completely changed how scientists understood this famous food. And it's a reminder that sometimes the smallest, most invisible things can shape the foods we recognize around the world. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, share it with someone curious, and subscribe for more surprising histories behind the simple things we see every day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.